Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Corby Connections. I'm Rick Stahl, president of the Notre Dame Club of Gettysburg. And tonight, with our special guest, we have a special treat. We're going to go inside Notre Dame Stadium with our guest, head usher, retired head usher, Cappy Gagnon. And before we get to Cappy, of course, you know the drill. We can't get started without bringing in our host for Corby Connection, Pat Colley. Pat?
Thank you, Rick. And we are very excited to have Cappy with us this evening for this episode of Corby Connections. Before we get started, I want to ask people who have been watching these videos to click the thumbs up button to like the video. Please share it with 2 or 3 people who you think might like to watch these videos, and consider becoming a member of the Notre Dame Club of Gettysburg. If you want more information, you can go to www.ndgettysburg.com. Cappy, thank you so much for your time and for joining us. You were the head usher at Notre Dame Stadium for 15 years, but before that, you gained an awful lot of relevant experience in private security. So after you graduated from Notre Dame in 1966, you went to work maintaining security for musicians and celebrities in arenas and other venues all over the place. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I did a lot of things before that, but probably the one event that I did that most qualified me for the Notre Dame Stadium job was I was security on Cher's World Tour in 1990. And during that time, we were in most of the famous and large venues in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. And that gave me familiarity with not just security work that I'd previously done, but with handling major venues. So when the stadium job was available, that was probably one of the better parts of my background to qualify for.
Yeah, and I don't mean to give short shrift to the other experiences you had before engaging in that role and then coming back to Notre Dame, but I understand, you know, when you're hobnobbing with celebrities, that you actually came into possession of a certain script of interest to Notre Dame viewers before anybody else did. What can you tell me about that?
One of the security jobs that I had was an undercover assignment in a talent agency, a creative artist agency in Beverly Hills. And I was undercover, so the fake job that I had was as the concierge. So while I was signing for scripts as the concierge, what I was really doing was screening the people that entered our offices. And just as an aside, Cheers was on at that time, and if a Cheers script came in, I might take a minute or two to read a few pages. But one day a script came in, and it was Rudy by Daniel Rudiger, and didn't mean anything to me at the time. And I called the agent for the actor for whom the script was pitched, and the line was busy. So I just kind of thumbed through a couple of pages of it, and I saw Dame on the top of one of the pages and Notre on the bottom of the previous page. I went back to the title page, and I remembered now Daniel Rudiger because I was at the Rudy game when he played. So I put 2 and 2 together. I read a couple of pages of the script and took it in my briefcase, put it in my briefcase and took it home. My wife said, "You stole a script?" And I said, "No, I just took it home for safekeeping." So I read the script, and it was a too hanky read for me, and brought it back the next morning, and I presumed it would become a movie in 48 hours, but it actually took 5 years for it to wend through the various processes before it became a movie. So I saw Rudy play, and I saw the script long before anybody else did.
Well, with your trained eye in security, would you please dispel the myth that I hear from our opposing fans all the time that Rudy was offsides?
No comment.
Okay, good enough. Well, I'm already sensing that your early career as a Notre Dame graduate gave you a more interesting life than I've had, for sure. And I hesitate to ask too many questions before I get into things you're not allowed to talk about. But I've seen you in other speeches or interviews that you've given talk about the likes of Dolly Parton and Michael Jackson, and you mentioned Cher. I mean, each of these probably had its own set of its own flavor and its own set of challenges.
Well, I worked for the finest person in the business in protecting media figures. I want to give a big plug to Gavin DeBecker. He's an outstanding man and very good in his profession. I was fortunate enough to work for him. And the rules in our company are such that we don't discuss our clients. And the only reason I have even permitted these to be mentioned is that my involvement with them became public for various reasons, primarily media coverage. So we're not giving away any proprietary information, but yes, those were some clients that we had.
Very interesting. So what brought you back to Notre Dame?
Notre Dame. You know, from the first day I looked at the campus, the summer of my heading into my senior year of high school, first time I ever saw the campus, it just felt like home. And from my first day as a student, it just felt like home for me. And I never wanted to leave and always wanted to come back. And in 1995, my children were grown and married and on their own. And I packed up my car and drove 2,410 miles in 48 hours and arrived back here at Notre Dame without a job. And the police chief at Notre Dame was a good friend of mine. So I called him and told him that I was back in town, didn't expect to be, so I hadn't bought my tickets. I said, is there any kind of security job I could do so I could see the games? And next thing I know, I was handed the master key to the stadium. I should mention that the man that did the hiring was associate athletic director at the time, Bubba Cunningham, and he's now the athletic director at the University of North Carolina. He's a very fine man and obviously a great judge of talent. That was a joke.
You know, during your time as the head usher, so from that day of your return, and then as you assumed that responsibility, there was a motto that I think you started, and it was "Welcome to Notre Dame," and it was sort of a reflection that you and the other ushers on your team were not just taking tickets, but you were recognizing that this was an experience of coming home for a lot of Notre Dame fans, and even for opposing fans. I think that coming to Notre Dame Stadium is something that's sort of on their bucket list. It's something that they want to do. It's important to the history of college football. And I think you developed an approach to recognize that this is not like going to a concert, you know, where the actual place means something in itself separate from what will happen in that place. Tell me about that approach that you took as head usher.
Well, working with Bubba Cunningham, my boss, we determined that we wanted to let's say, modernize the approach that the ushers had used. Back in the day, basically, an usher in the stadium, and unfortunately too many colleges still do it now, they just take tickets and point you at a seat. And we wanted to create a hospitality model over and above that. And I remember that Bubba and I had several meetings where we would say, are we going to adopt the Disney model or the Dodgers model or the Nordstrom model? And one day, and Bubba and I keep arguing with each other, I think he suggested it, he thinks I suggested it. We said, what about the Notre Dame model? We always strive for excellence. So we determined that we were going to have a large change in the philosophy of what the ushers were there to do. Instead of just checking off tickets and pointing to locations and perhaps enforcing rules, we wanted to be hosts. So as much as we could, we tried to use the word hosts and ambassadors instead of ushers. And we thought that instead of these being fans that we were welcoming, that they were guests. And if you think of how you would have guests in your home, we wanted to present that same kind of feeling. Well, how do you greet guests? You'd say, welcome. And that's what we wanted to do. And it was quite a bit of a different model from what had been going on at the time. And frankly, it's what I'm probably best known for there, and I'm real proud of it. It worked a lot better than my wildest dreams. We found some of the old veteran ushers who were maybe a little slower to accept the new model would come to me and say, "Boy, these fans are a lot more friendly than they used to be." And what it really was a reflection of was that these guests were now feeling like they were being welcomed. And I think it did a fine job. And again, bragging a little bit, we got a lot of calls from people in my position at other colleges saying when their alumni and fans had visited Notre Dame, they'd come away with a good impression. So a lot of people asked us to consult with them, and we felt good about that.
That's great. And I've read from time to time about stories that just, they go viral, as we say now with social media. The stories that just have to be told about one of your ambassadors, one of your ushers going the extra mile to make sure that somebody has a good experience. Somebody who just, maybe they're in a wheelchair and they just have to see the field once in their life. Do you have any particular stories along that line of people just going the extra mile for a fan?
Oh, many. In fact, Sam Henley, one of the great Notre Dame ushers. And Sam drove in from Virginia. And one time, Sam stopped for gas along the way and happens to chat for a second with a gas pump. And he stops a second time further along the way, and there's that same guy at a gas pump. And they started a conversation, and Sam told the guy, "If you meet me after the game, I'll give you a little extra tour," and did that. Well, here's a guy who's giving up several days, driving long distance, and made one particular person feel very special. And when you mentioned the wheelchair, we had an usher once that leaving the stadium, he spots an older man pushing a woman in the wheelchair, and it was obviously a difficult push for him. And he pushed them quite a large distance to where they happened to be parked. And most of these things go kind of unnoticed, except some of the recipients of those kind actions would contact me and tell me some of the things that have been done like that. Again, many times, I was told about actions that some of our ushers had taken above and beyond. The stories that I could tell about the stadium are, well, you don't have enough time. One time, one of the supervisors reported to me after the game that a man came into one of the gates very early, and he goes through the turnstile and keels over and dies. And the next two people in line behind him were, and this could only happen at Notre Dame, a heart surgeon and a priest. So the priest immediately leans over the man and begins the last rites, not knowing anything about the man. And the heart surgeon gives him a chest punch and brings him back. Now, where else but Notre Dame can you have your eternal life taken care of and your life here on earth brought back to you? And that was a wonderful story. We had another case where a woman who was heavily pregnant and probably shouldn't have been at the game was feeling labor pains. And so the usher supervisor for that area arranged to get her transported to the hospital. And he and his wife, they sort of adopted that out-of-town couple as the woman gave birth. We had ushers from 26 different states while I was in charge. And one guy came in from West Virginia, and he didn't know the fellows that he was working with. I mean, they just met together for 5 or 6 hours every football game. But when his daughter, who none of them really knew, when she got married back in West Virginia, all his fellow ushers went back to the wedding. And little stories like that are nice. I tell people things that they have a difficult time believing. I once closed up the stadium at 2 in the morning. And it was on a Tuesday. So I'm leaving the office because I was doing a little paperwork or something late at night. 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday. I close up the office and I turn around and a man comes running up to me and says, thank goodness I found you. He said, I came down for a stadium tour. And I said, you can't believe we're giving a stadium tour at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. He said, I flew in from China just for this. And before I could laugh, he pulled out his business card, and on one side it was in Chinese, and the other side it was in English. And what he had done is his company in Chicago had called him in for a meeting. He'd flown from China, gone to the meeting. When the meeting ended, he rented a car and drove to Notre Dame at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, hoping he could see the stadium. Well, how do you turn that guy down for a stadium tour? I also tell a story. I was in charge of security in the Joyce Center, and every year Notre Dame hosts the largest baton twirling competition in the world. It's called AYOP, American Youth on Parade. It's in late August, and it's the one time of the year that many of us in the athletic department can take some time off. So I had some of my people in charge, but I would go over every day for a half hour or so just to look in on things. But when I did, I made sure that I didn't dress like I was in charge. I didn't want to get roped into working, and I didn't want my subordinates to feel like I was taking over. So one day I'm over there for the event, and it's lunchtime, and it was a good time to leave. So I'm among a group of 8,000 or 10,000 people that are departing from the exits. And as I came out one of the exits in a huge crowd of people, I noticed what looked like a husband and a wife and a teenage daughter standing off to the side. And the wife, trying to impersonate it, it was kind of like this, looking down. And so it looked like, frankly, she was praying, but nobody sits outside the Joyce Center facing baton twirlers to pray. So I thought maybe she wasn't feeling well. So I kind of kept my eye on her. But as I'm walking out, I'm still looking around. And just as I got to where she was, she looked up right where I was, looked me in the eye and said, "Excuse me, could you help me?" And I said, "Sure." She said, "Do you know if we could get a tour of the football stadium?" I said, "Well, because the campus is kind of shut down, there's only one person in America that could give you a tour of the football stadium." She said, "Who's that?" And I said, "It's me." And she introduced me to her husband, Colonel Billy Walker, Associate Athletic Director of the Air Force Academy, and her daughter, who was going to go to Northwestern. And she said, when we saw that Notre Dame was not too far away, we drove down here, and we were hoping we could get a look at the stadium. Well, I can't turn it down. I gave them a tour of the stadium. So when it was over, we went and grabbed a bite. And I said, I couldn't help but notice it looked like you might have even been praying when I first saw you. And she says, "Yes, I was praying to St. Anthony that he would provide me with a way for us to see the stadium. And St. Anthony never lets me down." Now, where else but Notre Dame can stories like that happen?
These stories are giving me chills, and I'm sure you could talk for hours of stories like this. I mean, what an amazing way to touch the lives of people on behalf of Notre Dame. So, I'm sure that this had to have had all these great uplifting experiences came with challenges. And as I was thinking about this interview before it started, I was thinking, what kind of challenge you would have with a huge venue, many, many points of ingress and egress. In the last 20 years, of course, terrorism and now a pandemic have come onto the scene. It had to have been grueling in a sense to prepare so that you could at least cover as much as you possibly could, knowing that some things were out of your control.
Well, we had a couple of major advantages. We had terrific cooperation between the Notre Dame Police Department and the athletic department. We had terrific cooperation among all the major law enforcement agencies in the area, the state police and the South Bend Police and the St. Joe County Police and the Notre Dame Police. And also, in those days, a stadium of our size might have 200 or 300 paid ushers, as we did. They did not have 550 volunteer ushers, as we did. So we were by far the largest stadium usher program in the country. So the additional personnel that we had gave us an opportunity not just to be better in our hospitality, but better when we had to concern ourselves with the logistics of maybe bad things that could happen. For example, before we opened the gates, we searched the stadium. And we went through the entire stadium, primarily initially for, like all the bathrooms completely taken care of by maintenance. Is there any spilled water anywhere in the concourse? Is there any ice on any of the ramps? Things like that. And so we were making sure that the home of the Fighting Irish, where we were the host, was in good condition. Well, it's not that difficult then to add, after the terrorism became a factor, it's not difficult to add, in addition, look for things that seem out of place or don't belong. And again, because we had so many volunteer ushers and the program was so large, there were opportunities for us to have much more direct contact with people coming into the stadium. But logistics was the big part of the job. And even though I stood in the end zone for every single game, I can't tell you the number of times I would have to turn to somebody next to me and say, what happened on that play? Because I was responding, on my radio or to a private message about something. So it's not the greatest place to be a fan because the perspective is too low. And if you're concerned with making sure everything's going well, maybe it's not the best place to keep track of the ball, but it certainly was where the heartbeat of the stadium was.
I was wondering about that. It seems like your initial plan of talking to the head of Notre Dame police about getting in to see the game really fell apart, because that's no way to watch a game. I see.
Yeah. But I didn't see the game as well as I expected. He sure did a wonderful job for me.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time, but I also want to pivot to something that's a little bit related, and because you have a whole window into another aspect of Notre Dame, and that is Notre Dame baseball. And in fact, you are the author of a book called Notre Dame Baseball Greats. When I distribute this video, I'm going to include a link to Amazon, unless you have a preferred way for people to order your book.
That's fine.
But people might want to check that out. So from a very young age, you loved the game of baseball. And I saw you speak elsewhere about how your mom bought you Ethan Allen's All-Star Baseball and you collected baseball cards. So tell me about that. Your background is of your love for baseball.
It began with baseball cards. I actually was collecting baseball cards before I'd ever done anything with baseball. And I was kind of a savant at 9 years of age. My father would bring me into the machine shop that he ran, and you've got all these men who are huge baseball fans, and he would say to them, ask Cap a question. And no matter what the question was, I had the answer because I had read baseball cards. And my father was a fan, and my mother's father was a huge fan. And so I was just kind of enamored with the game and the history of the game. And I had this ability to read the back of baseball cards and never forget a word on them. And it's funny, you would think I would have been a good history student, because history is names and dates and places and people. I wasn't a terribly good history student, but I was a very good baseball history student. And my junior year at Notre Dame, the great professor, Tom Stritch, recommended me for a student internship in our sports publicity department, what is now sports information, but sports publicity back then. So I got an interview with legendary Charlie Callahan to work in his office. And while I'm being interviewed, and he was kind of a crotchety old guy, I noticed on the wall he had a baseball picture. And I said, oh, I like baseball. And he said, who did Carl Hubble fan consecutively in the 1934 All-Star game? And when I rattled off the names, he said, can you start Monday? So that began my Notre Dame interest in baseball. And one of my jobs was to tidy up our files and in the sports publicity department. And when I found some files on Notre Dame baseball, I just became attracted to it. And I wrote in 1965, I wrote an article for Baseball Digest based on what I learned then. And when I joined SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research, about 10 years later, I was asked by these great baseball historians what project I was working on. And I glibly said that I was writing a book on Notre Dame baseball. So 41 years after I wrote the article, I was able to swiftly complete that book.
Yes, I saw elsewhere that you that article that you got, you may have fudged how much work you had already done on it too, but hey, they were going to pay you a little bit of money to write a 2,500 word piece on a subject you love. So what the heck?
I was a big fan of Baseball Digest, and I saw that they had independent writers. So I wrote their editor and said I had an article, which of course was only in my mind, but he wrote me back that he would pay me $50 if I got it to him in a short period of time. And at that time, Notre Dame was paying me $1 an hour, so $50 was quite a bit of money. And I wrote that article that was only in my mind previously. My father then bought every copy of Baseball Digest in our hometown of Gloucester, Massachusetts.
So your book features Notre Dame players who figured prominently in the history of baseball, and at least some of them are now recognized at the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. Who are some of the more memorable Notre Dame figures that people might not know were Notre Dame people?
Well, the two most famous are the two Hall of Famers, Cap Anson, who was the most significant baseball figure of the 19th century, and Carl Yastrzemski from my hometown Red Sox. But recently, I'm really, really proud of Craig Counsell. I knew Craig when he was an infant because his dad was a couple of years ahead of me at Notre Dame. And Craig had a wonderful major league career, and of course he's now a major league manager, so he's an important one. But many, many great players. Ed Rollbach and Cy Williams were two people from the early 1900s who are borderline Hall of Fame type players. And I played golf with Frank Carpin, who pitched in the major leagues, and I'm real proud of knowing Frank, and he had a nice career. And Sean Fitzmaurice had a cup of coffee in the majors, and he was at Notre Dame about the same time I was. So we had some significant people.
You know, I was surprised because most people, of course, think of Notre Dame and they associate it with football. But, you know, I think your book goes into how common it was to see people out on the diamond playing baseball on the Notre Dame campus in, say, the late 1800s or early 1900s. It was just an enormously popular game. And, of course, back then, Notre Dame had young students, say, elementary school or a little bit older than that, and then all the way up through college. And there were just kids of all ages out there playing baseball.
Yes, in fact, as you said, we had an elementary school. They were called the Minims. And we didn't call it a high school. We had a prep school, and then we had the university. So back in the late 1800s, we had 400 or 500 students on campus, maybe 300 in the college, and another 150 in the prep school, and another 100 in the elementary school. And sports were a big part of the campus life because didn't have the internet, didn't have Zoom, and you had to keep the kids active. And baseball was a very big sport at that time, long before football was. And at one time, we had 300 students on campus, and more than 200 of them played baseball. And we had 9 diamonds on the campus. And so it was an early significant sport at Notre Dame. We had 40 people in the major leagues before World War I. So you think today that you have to be in the Sun Belt to play, which is true. But back in those days, we were way ahead of the Sunbelt programs.
You know, coming into this talk, I thought, well, this is kind of an obscure interest, Notre Dame baseball. So I'll learn a thing or two, and I absolutely have, just even what we just talked about. But I also learned that, you know, Father Soren and Babe Ruth share a birthday. And I know that Brian Kelly, like you, grew up a Red Sox fan. So I'm convinced there's some sort of divine plan here that links Notre Dame and baseball together.
Absolutely. I actually think there's a divine plan around my own life in this regard. I mentioned the first time I saw Notre Dame was heading into my senior year in high school. We visited other colleges my father recommended to me, and I had thrown Notre Dame in the hopper as one to see, and I couldn't tell you to this day why I chose Notre Dame. I had not been a Notre Dame fan. So we visited all these other colleges in the East, and then we had to drive to all this way to South Bend. And we got to Main Circle, and there was a student giving the campus tours, wonderful student, July 3rd. And we take about 5 feet into the South Quad, and I see the Gold Dome. And I turned to my mother and I said, "This is where I'm going to school." So we finished the tour. And my father says, "Well, if Cappy wants to go here, we better go see if we can find some literature." And my mother says, "Well, it's the 4th of July weekend. The entire campus is closed." And my father said, "Well, there might be a brochure rack at the main building." So we go over to the main building, and my father said, I'll ask the groundskeeper." And he points over to an older man with white hair, black pants, white T-shirt, who's tending the tulips up front of the dome, you know, the groundskeeper, the gardener. So my father says to him, "Do you know if there's any place where we can get a brochure on Notre Dame admission, because my son here would like to come to Notre Dame?" So the gardener took out a key and said, "I can help you." And we walk in the basement level, and he unlocks the door to the main building. And then the first door on the left at that time was the admissions office. And he unlocks the door to the admissions office, and he said, "I'm Father Moran, Dean of Admissions." Now, where else but Notre Dame would an executive of the university be gardening the tulips in front of the campus on the 4th of July weekend? So he asked me my grades and SATs, and I happened to qualify for something called early decision. So I applied in September, and I was accepted in October. So this was July of 61. In July of 64, I'm the student who's giving the campus tours, okay? In July of 1970, I'm the student who is assistant director of admissions, determining who gets into the university. And in 1995, I'm guarding the stadium. And my mother reminded me till the day she died that when we got our campus tour, the stadium gates were open, and I went down on the field and hugged the stadium or the goalpost in the end zone. So 34 years after my first visit on campus, I'm keeping people away from the goalpost in the stadium. So to me, all of that was fated. It was meant to be. And if you try to say that at any other university, people might laugh at you, but I think at Notre Dame, we understand.
I think there's a lot of people who will be watching this and nodding. So thank you for these wonderful stories, Cappy. You've given us a lot of time and a lot of great stories, and we're just very appreciative. The whole Notre Dame Club of Gettysburg thanks you.
My pleasure. Thank you, and go Irish.
And I'll kick it back to Rick here. Rick, any final words?
Pat, again, thank you for hosting this. And Cappy, I'm like Pat, I got goosebumps and want to go out here and get in the car and start driving to South Bend. So thank you very much for them great stories. And I know on the behalf of all of us here in Gettysburg, they're really going to enjoy this part of Corby Connection. And again, thank you for taking your time and joining us this evening, and we wish you well, and we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and please take care. If you ever come to Gettysburg, please drop us a line. We'd love to meet you here in Gettysburg.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, and go Irish.
Go Irish.